the explosive, high-pitched laughter of Judge Sarah Miller, a sound as rare as a snowstorm in Savannah, suddenly cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand, oak-paneled courtroom like a serrated blade, shattering years of rigid protocol in a single uncontained burst of mirth that left everyone present completely paralyzed. It was one of those raw, authentic moments where the absolute, almost ridiculous contrast between the gravity of the law and the unfiltered absurdity of the immediate reality was simply too much to bear, especially for a woman of her high standing who had spent her entire illustrious career cultivating a reputation for icy professionalism and a demeanor so severe it could freeze a lawyer's words mid-sentence. Standing right in the center of the courtroom well, completely oblivious to the waves of confusion and stunned amusement radiating from the shocked onlookers, was a tiny 4-year-old boy in a miniature, impeccably tailored navy blue suit and a little striped tie, holding a large black smartphone to his ear with the stone-faced, unwavering seriousness of a seasoned CEO about to close $1 billion deal. The sheer audacity of the child, combined with the explosive near-hysterical reaction of the normally terrifying judge, who was now leaning back in her massive high-backed leather chair, her face flushed red with laughter and her tears flowing freely as she smacked her polished palm against the massive mahogany bench, created a scene of pure, unforgettable spectacle. The bailiff, a man named Benjamin, whose back was usually as stiff and unyielding as an old pine tree, stared toward the high-ceiling tiles as he often did when the courtroom veered dangerously off the tracks, but even he couldn't entirely hide the twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth as he watched the bizarre unfolding drama. The dozen or so high-priced lawyers, accustomed to Judge Miller's sharp tongue and stern warnings, exchanged bewildered glances, their sophisticated strategies and complex arguments completely forgotten in the face of this unpredictable human outburst. And there was the small boy Leo, with his short, curly blonde hair neatly parted and his tiny fingers gripping the expensive phone with absolute unshakable conviction that what he was doing was the single most necessary and reasonable thing in the entire world, completely oblivious to the chaos and the staring eyes surrounding him on all sides. He didn't blink, he didn't waver. He just stood his ground with the natural confidence that only a very small child, convinced of their own infallible logic, could possibly possess in a situation that would normally be terrifying for most adults. He tilted his head slightly, listening intently to the faint, steady sound of the dial tone echoing through the high-ceilinged room, a sound that only he could hear in that moment. The entire atmosphere in the courtroom had been instantly transformed from one of tense legal maneuvering to something raw, human, and utterly compelling, leaving everyone breathlessly waiting to see what this tiny disruption would do next. Comment where you're watching from. The tension in the room began to shift from bewildered amusement to a heavy, thick curiosity as the realization set in that this wasn't just a random toddler wandering onto a stage, but a deliberate, calculated move by a child who seemed to know exactly what he was doing. To understand how little Leo ended up standing in the crosshairs of the law, one had to look at the cold, clinical efficiency of the man he had just outsmarted, Claude Foster, a high-priced attorney known for his sharp suits and an even sharper lack of empathy. Just moments earlier, during a grueling recess in a high-stakes custody battle, Leo had executed a feat of silent agility that would have made a professional spy green with envy. While his grandmother was distracted by a conversation in the gallery, Leo had slipped away, moving with the quiet grace of a shadow across the polished floors, slipping behind the defense table and lifting Foster's personal smartphone right out of his coat pocket without the man even noticing. It was a masterclass in stealth, driven by the kind of pure, unadulterated focus that only a 4-year-old can muster when they believe a grave injustice needs to be corrected. Judge Sarah Miller had watched the entire sequence from her elevated bench, her sharp eyes following the small human in the navy suit as he navigated the sacred space between the public and the law. She had intended to call for order, to demand that the child be removed, but something about his calm deliberation stopped her. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't the thunderous roar the lawyers expected, but a curious, almost gentle inquiry that betrayed her internal fascination. "What exactly are you doing there, little man?" she had asked, the corners of her mouth already beginning to twitch as she leaned over her spectacles. Leo didn't look up, his thumb moving over the screen with practiced ease until he found a specific contact. "Calling," he replied, his voice small but remarkably steady, echoing through the vast chamber with a clarity that made the court reporter pause mid-stroke. The sheer audacity of the child was a breath of fresh air in a room usually filled with the suffocating scent of old paper and bitter lies. Sarah Miller, a woman who had spent 23 years on the bench watching families tear each other apart for sport, found herself momentarily captivated by this tiny act of defiance. She looked at the boy's stubborn chin and his fierce, intelligent eyes, recognizing a spark of something familiar, though she couldn't quite place it yet. As Leo pressed the phone to his ear, the courtroom held its breath, caught in a rare moment of levity where the rules of the world seemed to suspend themselves just for him. Claude Foster, finally realizing his phone was missing, opened his mouth to protest, but a single sharp look from Judge Miller silenced him instantly. She wanted to see where this was going. The boy wasn't calling a friend or a cartoon character. He was dialing a number with the intentionality of a soldier calling for backup. He stood there, the navy fabric of his suit slightly too big for his small frame, looking like a miniature version of the very people who spent their lives arguing in this room. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing, as the ringtone vibrated in the stillness, and for the first time in her career, Sarah Miller felt the heavy weight of her own robe. She had built a legacy on the letter of the law, on being a provider of justice who never let emotion cloud her judgment. Yet here was a child who didn't care about protocols or channels. He only cared about the person on the other end of that line. The atmosphere was charged with an electric sense of anticipation, a feeling that the comedy was about to end and something much more profound was about to take its place. Every eye in the room was fixed on that phone, waiting for a voice to answer, waiting to see who could possibly be so important that a 4-year-old would risk the wrath of a Georgia judge to reach them. Little did Sarah know that the simple act of this boy stealing a phone was about to trigger a landslide that would bury her carefully constructed world. The silence in the courtroom grew so dense it felt like you could reach out and touch it, a thick blanket of anticipation that made the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sound like a sledgehammer hitting a nail. Judge Sarah Miller sat perched on her high-backed leather throne, her initial explosion of laughter having settled into a sharp, focused curiosity that made the veteran lawyers in the front row shift uncomfortably in their seats. They knew that look. It was the look she gave right before she dismantled a witness, but this time the target wasn't a lying informant. It was a 4-year-old boy named Leo who was currently holding the entire legal system of Savannah hostage with a stolen iPhone. Leo's grandmother, a woman with silver hair and a face etched with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, sat frozen in the second row of the gallery, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn leather handbag, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a strange, flickering hope that she didn't dare name aloud. She had brought Leo here because she had nowhere else to take him, never imagining that the boy would seize a moment of chaos to stage a protest that would bring the highest court in the county to a grinding halt. As the ringtone echoed faintly through the smartphone speaker, Leo's tiny face remained a mask of pure, unadulterated conviction, his small brow furrowed in a way that mirrored the judge's own habitual expression. Sarah Miller watched him, and for a fleeting second, she felt a strange, cold shiver slide down her spine. There was something in the boy's eyes, a piercing, unfiltered judgment that seemed to see right through her black silk robes and into the person underneath the title. "Calling who?" she pressed again, her voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register, her curiosity now outweighing her professional duty to restore order. Leo tilted his head, his tiny pigtails, his short curls bouncing slightly, and he looked her straight in the eye with a gaze that didn't hold a single ounce of fear. "Whoever I want," he repeated, and that was the moment the laughter died for good. It didn't flicker out like a candle. It vanished like a light switch being flipped in a dark room. The lawyers, including the cold and calculated Claude Foster, sat in a stunned trance, realizing that the gravity of the courthouse had been momentarily suspended by a child who didn't understand the concepts of proper channels or judicial credibility. Foster, the owner of the stolen phone, opened his mouth to finally demand his property back, his face a shade of purple that matched his expensive silk tie, but Judge Miller raised a single, commanding finger, silencing him without even looking in his direction. She was captivated by the sheer, raw humanity of the scene, a stark contrast to the sterile, paper-thin arguments that usually filled her days. She began to wonder about the boy's life, about the circumstances that would lead a 4-year-old to believe that his only recourse was to hijack a legal proceeding. Was he a pawn in the custody battle happening just minutes before? Or was he something else entirely? The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the digital pulse of the phone, and suddenly, the call connected. A faint, crackling sound emerged from the device, the sound of someone picking up on the other end, and the judge leaned forward, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs in a way she hadn't felt in decades. The boy's tiny hand gripped the phone tighter, and he whispered a single word that shattered the room. "Mommy." The voice that came back through the speaker was clear, high definition, and unmistakable. It was a voice that Sarah Miller knew better than the sound of her own gavel hitting the wood. It was a voice that hadn't spoken to her in over 2 long, agonizing years. The voice of her estranged daughter, Julia. "Leo? Leo, baby, is that you? How are you calling me?" The name of the child, the voice of the woman who had blocked her mother's number on every device she owned. The daughter who had moved across the country after a bitter argument about justice versus mercy. It all came crashing down on Sarah at once. The judge sat frozen, her hand still suspended in midair where she had been gesturing, looking like an actor who had suddenly forgotten every single line of the play. The eyes of the entire room were now fixed on her, the spectators sensing that the professional veil had been torn asunder, revealing a woman who was suddenly, painfully human. Julia had told her mother the last time they spoke that she never wanted to see her again, until she understood the weight of her failures, until she realized that the law was a map but not the territory. And now, here was Julia's voice, filling the very courtroom where Sarah reigned as queen, brought there by a grandson she had only seen in grainy, stolen social media photos. The irony was a physical blow, a sharp pain in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Leo held the phone out toward the bench, his eyes fixed on Sarah with a look of total, unwavering attention, as if he were waiting for her to finally deliver a verdict on her own life. In that moment, the grand oak-paneled room felt small, and the high-backed chair felt like a cage. Sarah Miller, the woman who dealt in cold statutes and hard facts, was suddenly standing on a cliff edge, looking down into the messy, emotional reality she had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The atmosphere in the courtroom didn't just change. It curdled. The air became thick, heavy with the kind of electricity that precedes a devastating lightning strike, as the voice of Julia Miller, vibrant, desperate, and hauntingly familiar, vibrated through the high-definition speakers of the stolen phone. Judge Sarah Miller felt the world tilt on its axis. For 2 years, she had maintained a facade of granite-like stoicism, telling herself that the silence from her only daughter was a necessary consequence of upholding the law. But hearing that voice now was like having her soul flayed open in front of a gallery of strangers. The lawyers in the front row, sensing a seismic shift in the room's power dynamic, stopped their whispering and sat as still as statues. Claude Foster, the attorney whose phone had been swiped, looked like he had been turned to stone. His face, previously flushed with anger, was now a ghostly, translucent white. He knew something the rest of the room didn't, and his sudden terror was palpable. Sarah's eyes, usually as sharp and cold as flint, were wide and glassy, fixed on the tiny boy who stood there like a miniature executioner delivering a final sentence. "Mommy, I'm in the big room with the lady in the black dress," Leo said, his voice echoing with a haunting innocence that made the judge's heart stop. She was laughing, but she stopped. On the other end of the line there was a sharp, jagged gasp. A sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "Leo? Is she looking at you? Get away from the bench, baby, please," Julia pleaded, her voice breaking into a sob that tore through the courtroom's silence. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Why was her daughter so terrified? Why would a mother react with such visceral horror to her child being in the presence of his own grandmother? The judge looked down at the child, then at Claude Foster, and finally at her ex-husband's attorney. And that's when the first jagged piece of a much darker puzzle fell into place with a sickening thud. Her gaze drifted to the caller ID on the screen that Leo was now tilting toward her. It wasn't just a phone number. Under the contact name, there was a series of archived notes and legal file tags that Sarah recognized instantly from her own private system. Her breath hitched. This phone didn't just belong to a random lawyer. It was the primary device used to coordinate a secret, back-channel operation she had authorized months ago, thinking she was protecting her family through the proper legal maneuvers. But as she stared at the screen, she saw a notification pop up over the call. A text message from a name she recognized as a private investigator she had personally vetted. It read, "Target located. Moving in to take the boy while the judge keeps the gallery distracted. Everything is legal on paper." The blood drained from Sarah's face until she looked like a corpse. She looked at the heavy, double-oak doors at the back of the courtroom, and for the first time in her life, she saw the security guards standing there not as protectors, but as hunters. Leo wasn't just a guest. He was a target in a trap she had accidentally helped build. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, leaving her gasping for air. She had spent her life believing that the law was a shield for the innocent, but she was looking at evidence that it had been twisted into a weapon against her own flesh and blood. Julia's voice came through again, a frantic scream now. "Mommy, if you're listening, please. Don't let them take him. I know what you did." Sarah's gavel, the symbol of her absolute power, sat heavy and useless on the bench. She looked at Leo, who was now looking at the back doors with a growing sense of unease, his small hand reaching out to touch the hem of her black robe as if seeking protection from the very woman who had signed the orders that put him in danger. The room was no longer a place of justice. It was a cage closing in. The question burned in her mind, hot and acidic. Had she become the very monster she spent her career putting behind bars? As the heavy doors at the back of the room began to creak open and two men in dark suits stepped into the light, Sarah realized the clock had run out. Was this the law? Or was this a kidnapping sanctioned by her own hand? The heavy brass-handled oak doors at the rear of the courtroom groaned as they swung open, admitting two men whose presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. They weren't wearing the standard-issue uniforms of court bailiffs. They were dressed in charcoal gray tactical suits, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses, moving with a synchronized, predatory grace that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with enforcement. Judge Sarah Miller felt a wave of nausea roll over her as she looked from the security team to the glowing screen of the stolen phone, where the text message about taking the boy still simmered like a venomous threat. The realization was a jagged shard of glass in her heart. Her own signature sat at the bottom of a sealed emergency protection order she had signed in chambers just 48 hours ago, fueled by the manipulative lies of her ex-husband's legal team. They had told her Julia was unstable, that the child was in danger, and Sarah, blinded by her own resentment and her obsession with proper legal channels, had authorized a recovery action she never expected to see manifest in her own courtroom. Now the cold reality was staring her in the face. Julia's voice was still screaming through the speaker, a raw, jagged sound of maternal terror that stripped away every ounce of Sarah's judicial poise. "Mommy, they're coming for him, aren't they? You used your bench to steal my son." The accusation echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing back at Sarah like a physical indictment. She looked down at Leo, who had finally noticed the men approaching. The boy didn't cry. Instead, he did something that broke Sarah's heart into a million pieces. He stepped closer to her, his tiny hand firmly gripping the heavy midnight black fabric of her judicial robe, seeking sanctuary from the very person who had unwittingly signaled his capture. The men in gray stopped at the bar of the court, their leader nodding toward Claude Foster, who had suddenly regained his smug composure. "Your Honor," Foster said, his voice dripping with a sickening faux professionalism, "as per the sealed order you issued, my team is here to take custody of the minor for his own safety. We should proceed before the situation escalates further." Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she had to hide them beneath the bench. She looked at the men, then at her grandson, whose wide, trusting eyes were looking up at her, waiting for the lady in the black dress to do something. The legal trap was perfect. It was a masterpiece of procedural manipulation. If she stopped them now, she would be violating her own court order, committing a massive breach of ethics that would end her career in a single afternoon. If she let them take him, she would be losing her soul. The conflict roared in her ears like a Category 5 hurricane. She looked at the gallery where Leo's grandmother, her own former mother-in-law, was now standing, her face a mask of silent, pleading agony. The room was no longer a hall of justice. It was a hunting ground, and the scent of blood was in the air. "Wait!" Sarah managed to croak out, the word feeling like it was being dragged over broken glass. The lead agent didn't stop. He reached out a gloved hand toward Leo's shoulder. The boy recoiled, pressing his back against the mahogany bench, his small face finally crumpling into a mask of fear. "I said wait," Sarah roared, her voice finally finding its power, the sound echoing like a thunderclap that made the lawyers in the front row jump. She snatched the stolen phone from Leo's hand, her eyes scanning the contact list, the call logs, and the hidden folders with the speed of a woman whose life depended on it. She found it, a recorded voice memo titled Foster/Miller Strategy. With a trembling finger, she hit play. The courtroom speakers, usually reserved for evidence and testimony, suddenly filled with the clear, whispered voice of Claude Foster and her ex-husband, discussing how they had fabricated the instability evidence to trick the judge and how they planned to disappear the boy to a non-extradition country once the order was executed. The silence that followed the recording was suffocating. Every secret, every lie, and every dangerous truth was now out in the open, hanging in the air like a thick black smoke. The men in gray paused, sensing the shift in the wind, their hands moving toward their belts. Sarah looked at the men who had dared to turn her court into a kidnapping ring, and then she looked at the gavel. She realized that the proper channels had been poisoned from the start. The danger wasn't just coming. It was already here, standing 5 feet away from her grandson, and the only person with the power to stop it was the woman who had started it. The recording ended, but the echoes of the betrayal seemed to vibrate in the very molecules of the room, turning the air into something thick and toxic. Claude Foster's face transformed from a mask of smug professional arrogance to a jagged landscape of pure, unadulterated panic, as he realized the secret he had carefully buried in his digital vault was now echoing through the courtroom's high-fidelity sound system. The lead agent in the charcoal suit didn't flinch. Instead, he took a heavy, deliberate step toward the bench, his hand hovering dangerously close to the concealed holster at his hip. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a low mechanical growl that held no respect for the robe she wore. "That recording is inadmissible. You signed the order. We are taking the child. Stand aside." Sarah felt the hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of a mother's rage that had been dormant for decades. She looked down at Leo, who was now trembling, his small fingers twisting the fabric of her robe so tightly his knuckles were white. The boy's quiet sobbing was a more powerful indictment of her life's work than any legal argument could ever be. She realized that for years she had been a provider of the law, a woman who looked at families through the cold, distancing lens of a microscope, never realizing that the slides she was examining were made of human hearts. "The order was obtained through fraud upon the court," Sarah declared, her voice rising with a terrifying rhythmic power that seemed to shake the oak-paneled walls. "It is hereby vacated. Benjamin, secure the child." But the bailiff, usually her most loyal shadow, didn't move. He stood by the window, his face pale and his eyes fixed on a black SUV idling on the sidewalk outside. A vehicle Sarah now realized was filled with more men in gray. The trap wasn't just in the paperwork. They had compromised her entire staff. The courtroom, the temple of her power, had become a fortress for the enemy. Claude Foster leaned forward, a desperate, feral glint in his eyes. "You can't vacate it, Sarah. If you touch that kid, I'll have your bench by morning. You authorized this. You're just as guilty as we are." The words hit her like a physical blow, a reminder of the proper channels she had so blindly followed. She looked at the phone, still active, and heard Julia's voice, now a ghostly whisper. "He's my everything, Mom. Please." In that moment, the high-backed leather chair, the silver nameplate, and the 23 years of prestige felt like nothing more than a pile of dry leaves. Sarah did something then that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the gallery. She reached down and lifted Leo, pulling his small, warm body over the mahogany bench and into her lap, shielding him with her own black silk robes. She was no longer a judge. She was a grandmother protecting her cub. The lead agent lunged forward, his gloved hand slamming onto the bench, but Sarah didn't flinch. She snatched her heavy, brass-tipped gavel and instead of hitting the sounding block, she pointed it directly at the agent's face like a weapon. "Touch this boy, and I will ensure you never see the light of day in a state that doesn't have a death penalty," she hissed, her eyes burning with a fire that made the hardened mercenary momentarily recoil. But the escalation was far from over. From the back of the room, the second agent began closing the heavy double doors, locking the spectators inside. The lawyers scrambled toward the exits only to find them barred. This wasn't a legal proceeding anymore. It was a hostage situation in the heart of the Savannah courthouse. Secrets began to spill out like a ruptured dam. Foster, realizing his career was over, began shouting about the investments he had made in the local police and how no one was coming to save her. He revealed the hidden truth. This wasn't just about custody. Julia had discovered a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme involving the very firms that funded Sarah's judicial campaigns. The emergency protection order wasn't meant to protect Leo. It was meant to give them leverage to keep Julia silent. Sarah felt the world she had served for 30 years crumble into ash. She was the one who had opened the door for the wolves, and now they were inside the house. Leo buried his face in her neck, his tears soaking into her collar, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would either be the end of her life or the beginning of her redemption. She looked at the agent, who was now drawing a taser from his belt, and then at the phone in her hand. There was one more number in Foster's recent list, a number labeled Chief of Police Private Line. With a trembling finger, she realized the danger was much larger than the four walls of this room. The entire system was rigged, and she was the only one standing in the way of a total collapse. The air in the courtroom turned bone-chillingly cold as the true scale of the conspiracy settled over the room like a suffocating fog, and Sarah Miller realized with a jolt of pure terror that the high-backed bench she had occupied for decades wasn't a throne of power, but a target. Every heavy breath she took felt like inhaling crushed glass as she stared at the lead agent, who was no longer pretending to follow the rules of a civilized society. He was a wolf who had finally dropped the sheep's clothing, his posture coiled and lethal, his hand resting with terrifying intent on the weapon at his hip. Behind her, the rhythmic, desperate sobbing of little Leo, whose tiny face was buried in the crook of her neck, acted as a ticking clock, a constant reminder that every second she spent frozen in shock was a second closer to a tragedy that would haunt her into the grave. She looked at Claude Foster, who was now pacing the well of the court like a caged animal, his expensive suit rumpled and his eyes wide with the manic energy of a man who had already burned his boats and had nothing left to lose. "You don't understand, Sarah," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate, jagged edge that echoed off the high, uncaring oak ceilings. "This isn't just about a kid or a messy divorce. Your daughter found the ledgers. She found the offshore accounts that funded your last 3 elections, the ones you didn't ask questions about, because you were too busy upholding the law." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow to the sternum, leaving her gasping for air as the foundation of her entire identity, her integrity, her honor, her very soul cracked and splintered into a million jagged pieces. She had been the unwitting face of a criminal enterprise, a puppet in silk robes who had provided the legal cover for the very monsters she thought she was fighting. The emotional pressure in the room reached a screaming crescendo when the lead agent took another slow, deliberate step toward the bench, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet with the finality of a heartbeat stopping. "The phone, Judge," he commanded, his voice a flat, dead monotone that chilled her to the marrow. "Hand over the phone and the boy, and maybe you walk out of here with your pension. Keep playing hero, and we'll make sure the official record says you had a mental breakdown and became a danger to the child." Sarah looked at the heavy double doors at the back, realizing that the men in gray had completely isolated the room, turning her sanctuary into a tomb. She could see the silhouettes of more armed men through the frosted glass, and the realization that no help was coming, that the very people she would normally call for protection were likely on the payroll of the men standing before her, sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins that tasted like copper and fire. She clutched Leo tighter, her fingers digging into his small navy suit as she felt the weight of her own failures pressing down on her like a mountain. She had missed the birthdays, the holidays, and the heartaches because she was too busy building a legacy of paper, and now that legacy was a noose around her neck. "Grandpa Henry, Grandma," Leo whispered, his voice trembling with a child's intuitive understanding of impending doom. "Is the mommy coming?" The mention of Julia, who was still on the line, listening to her son's fear and her mother's desperation, broke the last tether of Sarah's professional restraint. She looked at the gavel on the bench, the symbol of her authority, and realized it was nothing more than a piece of wood. The true power was the small warm body in her arms and the fragile bridge of a phone call to the daughter she had nearly destroyed. She felt a profound, agonizing sense of something big is coming, a total collapse of the world she knew, and as the lead agent reached out a gloved hand to forcibly remove Leo from her lap, Sarah saw the red dot of a laser sight dance across the mahogany surface of her bench. It wasn't coming from the agents in the room, it was coming from the gallery. The betrayal was total. The pressure was at its absolute highest point, a screaming, vibrating tension that felt like it would shatter the windows. Sarah looked into the lens of the courtroom camera, realizing it was still live-streaming to the public archives, and a desperate, wild plan began to form in the wreckage of her mind. She wasn't just a judge on trial. She was a grandmother at war, and the first shot was about to be fired. The viewer must feel that the next moment will either be a miracle or a massacre, as Sarah Miller prepares to make the most dangerous ruling of her life. The courtroom, once a sterile theater of cold statutes, became the site of a historic, soul-shattering transformation as Judge Sarah Miller stood up, not as a magistrate of the state, but as the matriarch of a broken family claiming her redemption. With Leo clutched firmly in her left arm, she used her right hand to slam the heavy brass-tipped gavel down onto the mahogany bench with such prehistoric force that the sound didn't just echo, it cracked the very air, signaling the end of her life as a puppet and the birth of her life as a protector. "This session is not adjourned," she roared, her voice vibrating with a moral authority that no amount of money could buy. "It is being broadcast to the Federal Archives, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and every major news outlet in the state." She turned the stolen smartphone toward the high-definition courtroom camera, displaying the incriminating texts, the fraudulent orders, and the live connection to Julia, effectively turning the walls of her cage into a glass house for the world to see. The lead agent froze, his hand hovering over his weapon, paralyzed by the realization that killing a judge on a live global feed was a mission no payout could justify. Claude Foster slumped into his expensive leather chair, the color draining from his face as he watched his multi-million-dollar empire vanish into the digital ether in real time. The heavy oak doors were suddenly burst open, but not by the mercenaries. A team of state troopers, alerted by the broadcast and the frantic calls from the public, flooded the room, their weapons drawn and their orders clear. In the chaotic blur of arrests and shouting, Sarah didn't look at the cameras or the lawyers. She only looked at the small blonde boy in her arms who had finally stopped trembling. She descended the 3 steps of the bench, literally walking down from her high seat of judgment to the level of the people, and as she reached the floor, the heavy weight of 23 years of ego and isolation finally fell away. She walked straight past the cuffed Foster and the disgraced agents, out of the courtroom, and into the humid Savannah afternoon where a black sedan was screeching to a halt. The door flew open and Julia stumbled out, pale, thin from her health battles, but fueled by a ferocious maternal fire. The 2 women, separated by a canyon of silence for 2 years, met in a collision of tears and shared history. Sarah handed Leo into his mother's arms, and for the first time since the August afternoon the rift began, the wall of ice shattered completely. "I was wrong," Sarah whispered, the words finally free from the proper channels and the legal protocols. "I built a name and let my family crumble, but I'm finished being a judge, Julia. I just want to be a grandmother." The final resolution wasn't found in a legal ruling or a signed document, but in the quiet, messy, and beautiful process of a family rebuilding itself from the ash. Sarah officially retired that evening, trading her silk robes for a life of gardening, bedtime stories, and the hard, rewarding work of earning back her daughter's trust. The money laundering ring was dismantled, the fraudulent custody case was thrown out by a fair successor, and Julia's health began to stabilize in the warmth of her mother's newfound presence. Years later, Sarah would sit on her porch swing with a now-grown Leo, holding a small gray stone he had given her on the day they finally went home. She realized then that the greatest judgment she ever made wasn't in a courtroom, but in a split second of courage when she decided that being a human being was far more important than being a person of high standing. The laughter of the judge had died that day in October, but the heart of the mother had finally started to beat again, proving that it is never too late to descend from your bench and find your way back to the people who truly matter. As the Georgia sun sets over the marshes, the silence between Sarah and Julia is no longer a weapon, but a bridge built one shared dinner and one honest apology at a time, finishing the story not with a gavel strike, but with a family's embrace.